In reality, Karl Marx got it wrong. It's not religion, but materialism that's the opiate of the people. In a sense, you destroy people's religious life. You destroy their culture. You destroy their community. You deprive them of a goal structure, of a faith, which is essential, of an identity. You deprive of meaning in their lives. You deprive people of everything that they really need. And then you compensate them by giving them toys to play with, motor cars, television sets, radios, refrigerators. These are toys. You bribe them with these toys to accept what would otherwise be an insupportable lot.
The argument in favor of large farms and chemical farming is that by that you can increase the production and feed the masses.
The argument is totally false, of course, totally false. To begin with, the big farm, of course, does increase yields per unit of labor, but not yields per unit of land used. Now, for instance, you get much more land from an acre if it's farmed by a lot of people, farmed very carefully. You produce different crops, taking advantage of different types of land. The marshland, you have certain things, and the north-facing land, other things. Your production is incomparably greater. Even M.S. Swaminathan, the father of the Green Revolution in India, admits that the right size farm for India is 2.5 acres. It's small farms that maximize food production, not big farms. Now, of course, once you start introducing intensive cultivation, which is precisely what we're doing throughout the world, modernizing agriculture, which means making it capital intensive, making it increasingly dependent on all sorts of off-farm inputs, like fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation water, tractors, etc. You are killing the small farm. But you're doing more than that. You are forcing people to export their food, because you have to pay for this massive modernization. You've got to pay for the dams that provide the irrigation water, and they can cost hundreds of millions of dollars, if not thousands of millions of dollars each. So once you start doing that, you have to export the food just to pay the interest on the loans that you've contracted to build the dams and otherwise modernize your agriculture. Now, if you export your food, how are you going to feed local people? One of the main causes of malnutrition and famine in the third world today is the fact that the agriculture of these countries is geared to exports. And in many countries, up to 70 to 80% of the land is used for exporting food. How, in these conditions, can you feed people? Either you export your food or you eat your food. You can't do both. Well, still, this intensive cultivation with massive inputs is highly destructive. It's highly destructive in our parts of the world, in temperate areas where the soil is very solid, very robust, the high organic content, etc.
By keeping people on small farms, you are keeping them backward. Whereas if people come to the cities, they can have a taste of high living standard.
Well, I don't think that people would say that if they visited third world cities today. And they'd say it's still less if they visited third world countries, third world cities in 30 years' time. Because what you're seeing today is a massive development of huge, huge slums of incredible squalor. Incredible squalor. Already, the Delhi Planning Authority will tell you that 55% of the people in Delhi live in slums. And by the end of the century, it'll be 85%. It's the same in Bombay. It's much worse in South American cities. Because as you develop, as you destroy the small farm, and as you take away people's land in order to accommodate vast development schemes like huge dams, you see, what happens? All these people are forced into the cities. The people who go to the cities don't go there in order to take advantage of the amenities that cities provide. They go there because they're forced to go there. They are development refugees. They're refugees from development and from environmental destruction. And they pour into there, and at the rate we're going, half of humanity will be living in these squalid conditions. And no one in the world can say that people are better off living in these abominable conditions than they were previously when they owned their own land and produced their own food, even on a small scale.
So by keeping large numbers of people on small farms means there won't be many people in the cities and factories to produce cars, televisions, aeroplanes. That means that the lifestyle will be much simpler.
Well, there's enough people already in these cities to produce whatever we want to produce. There's no shortage. The people who go to the cities today are just accumulating as unemployed people or semi-employed people. They're not needed for the industries. In any case, we'll need far less motor cars. There's no way we can go on and increase motor car production. I mean, just look in this country. We want to increase the number of motor cars in Britain by between 80 and 120% by the end of the century, I think it is. Now, how are you going to do that? Look at our roads. The traffic is already paralyzed. We're spending £12 billion on new roads, but these new roads we're building are just going to increase our network by 2%. Now, how can you accommodate twice as many cars on a road network which you could only increase by 2% when our roads are already paralyzed? It doesn't make any sense. It's perfectly evident you're going to have to do with less cars and more trains, which is, even the government, they realize that. And if our government realizes it, then it must be perfectly apparent to everybody else. We've got to reduce the number of cars because cars use a lot of petrol and they produce greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide. And we know, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, set up by the United Nations, has told us in no uncertain terms that we've got to cut down the emission of greenhouse gases very drastically by 60 to 80% now, immediately, if we want to avoid a climatic catastrophe. And it's very much more important to avoid a climatic catastrophe than to have a whole lot of new cars. Man can live very well without cars. He's lived on this planet for millions of years without cars, but he cannot live without a favorable and stable climate.
But do you think that the science and technology will not be able to find a solution for the greenhouse gases and the climatic problems?
Well, I can't see any scientific gadgetry removing the greenhouse gases we've put into the atmosphere over the last 100 years. There's no way this is possible. It cannot be done. What science and technology can do is to give us other forms of transport and other forms of energy. That is possible. But there's a limit to what science and technology can do. We have been taught that science and technology can do everything. We have an almost religious faith in science and technology to solve all our problems. And it's a very misplaced faith indeed, because science and technology can solve a certain number of technological problems, like going to the moon. You see, it was a remarkable achievement to go to the moon, but it doesn't solve any problem. Man has never suffered from not going to the moon. He's had a lot of problems. That hasn't been one of them. But the problems we face today are due to the disruption of natural systems. And there science and technology can do very little. If a family breaks down, and you're seeing families break down all over the world, and that's why you've got this delinquency and crime and drug addiction, all these terrible social problems are largely due to the breakdown of the family and the community. We know that. There's no gadget that's going to put the family together again. There's no gadget that can bring back a community that's broken down, or can restore cultural pattern that holds together a society. There's no gadget that can bring back any of the 200 or 300 species of living things that we make extinct every day, many of which have never even been identified. There's no gadgetry that can actually do anything about the tropical forests we cut down, because once you cut them down, all the living things underneath, you see, are exposed to the elements. They no longer have this closed canopy to protect them, and a very large number of them simply die off. So there's this, science and technology is okay for certain things. But to suppose that it's going to solve all our problems is one of the great, great, great illusions we suffer from.
I understand your critique of science and technology. But do you think it would be possible to disinvent science and disinvent technology?
I'm not suggesting that it's going to be easy. I agree with you. People believe religiously in science. The scientists today are the priests of the industrial society. That's what they are. They dress in their white aprons just like priests dress in their ecclesiastical costumes. You know, they reek of formaldehyde just like priests reek of incense. They see, you know, they're always photographed next to their laboratory instruments, just like priests are photographed in their church with all their paraphernalia. They are the scientists. What they say goes. If you suggest that science is wrong, you're taken to be totally ignorant, almost an idiot, if you suggest there's something wrong with science. Things that are not scientific are necessarily false and indeed the work of a charlatan. That's how we see things. They are the gods of today. And they want to transform the world just as if they were God. Well, this is unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. Something's got to be done about it. It's quite evident. I don't believe in science. Quite frankly.
But what can be done about it?
We need a massive change. Fortunately, much of conventional knowledge is being discredited today. We see that all our experts are wrong on just about everything of importance. We see that our society is heading very rapidly towards disaster. In fact, now, a lot of serious people, all the people I know who study the problems that I'm interested in, agree that we are heading in the direction of the extinction of the human species. And that if we continue in the present direction, it is a question of time before this planet becomes uninhabitable. And I'm talking about decades, not centuries. We are moving now. We are making this planet uninhabitable. Every single day, this planet is less capable of supporting complex forms of life like man. Every day. Now, yet we're heading in that direction, which is totally, totally justified in the light of conventional wisdom. And when I say conventional wisdom, I mean the wisdom of our scientists and the wisdom of our economists and even of our sociologists and politicians. So there must be something radically wrong with the conventional knowledge that we teach in our universities. It's not only wrong, it's the opposite to the truth. People must begin to realize that. We need a very, very different view of the world. The most fundamental change that is required is that we see the real benefits that we require, real wealth, if you like, as being obtained from the normal functioning of the natural world. This is our real wealth. Our real wealth is our favorable and stable climate, which I've already referred to. It's fertile soil. It's abundant and pure water. We're not taught that. We're taught that all our wealth is man-made. Health is something that you obtain from hospitals or by eating pills. Education is something acquired in a specialized institution called school or university. Law and order is something produced by the police force in conjunction with the law courts and the prisons. Everything is man-made. Everything that we need, all benefits, all wealth, is derived from economic development. It's the opposite to the truth. Don't you see? That's the most important thing. Now, if you believe, if you accept today's position on what wealth is, then of course the only way to obtain this wealth and to satisfy man's needs and to increase our welfare and prosperity is to have more economic development, which we identify with progress. But if you see our real wealth as being derived from the biosphere, then you want as little of this economic development as possible. It's exactly the opposite. Your main preoccupation should be to preserve the critical order of the biosphere, from whose normal functioning we derive all the benefits on which we depend for our survival. It's the opposite worldview. And this, of course, was the worldview of traditional man. It's exactly how he saw the world. All benefits were derived from the normal functioning of the biosphere. And therefore his overriding goal was to preserve it. And the course of behavior, his behavior pattern, the cultural behavior pattern of a traditional society was designed to do just that, to preserve the critical order of the cosmos.
So you say that the traditional society, like people in Africa or the American Indians or people in India and Asia who lived simpler life, preserving nature and natural wealth, we should not have given them this notion of progress, because progress is what modern world believes in.
It's total illusion, progress. Life in a traditional society was much more complex, not more simple. Traditional man, first of all, had a very much more elaborate family and community life. Much, much more elaborate, with incredible range of rituals and ceremonies. Amazing vocabulary they had. some tribal people had vocabularies of 10, 20,000 words. You compare that to the average vocabulary of a delinquent in New York, which is about 300 to 400. Their life was not simple. It's very much more complex. I mean, the Yorubas in West Africa, to name just about one, there's two. Most people have about over 150 words for different members of the family. The Maoris in New Zealand had words for every single plant. I mean, you get a book on the New Zealand vegetation. Every plant, and there are thousands of them, has got a Maori name. How many people would know? How many people do you know in the world today who can name 1,000 plants by that? It doesn't exist. I don't think that this world is more. It's not a simpler life. It's actually in many ways more complex and more sophisticated. The life of traditional man. Of course, he doesn't have motor cars and television sets and all this paraphernalia that we produce today.
Are you saying that this materialistic way of life is not good, and therefore we must go to some religious worldview?
I think the idea of man as a rational animal is an absurdity. Absolute absurdity. A man is a rationalizing animal, not a rational one. He likes to justify what he's decided to do in advance. And the reason we give for doing things are the reasons that flatter us, the reasons that justify our policies. Government statistics, for instance, are the statistics which serve to justify government policies. That's what they are. That's why I don't attach too much importance to the figures that people bandy about. You see, the idea that you can have a rational man supposes that you can detach the neocortex from the rest of the brain, you see, and your old reptilian brain and all the way down to brain stem. You assume you can detach man's rationality from his emotions, his values. Scientists, that's what they assume. They really believe that it's possible to have a science that is value-free. They really believe that it's possible to have a science that isn't emotional. Science is the most emotional people in the world. They go absolutely berserk when you argue with them. If a scientist was sitting here with me, he'd be shaking with rage, full of emotions. The emotion they displayed by scientists when Rachel Carson's book was written was just astonishing. They went berserk because Rachel Carson actually suggested that the pesticides had invented, you see, and that added a great deal to their prestige. They'd invented this wonderful magical powder. You spread it over crops and killed all the pests. How brilliant our scientists are, how fantastic is progress. Rachel Carson suggested that all this stuff was a disaster, and that was a press. Well, they went berserk. They're highly emotional scientists, just like everybody else. If science is objective, it cannot be built up by observation, among other things, because observation is a totally subjective process. It's not the eyes. If I see you here, it's my brain that tells me that you're here. My eyes see lights and shadows, and my brain interprets those lights and shadows as being Satish Kumar. My brain might tell me that you're a waxworks image of Satish Kumar, or that you're someone disguised as Satish Kumar, or that I'm having an illusion or hallucination, or I'm drunk, or someone's playing a trick on me. But my brain tells me that you're there. It's my brain. It's a hypothesis I'm forming. Purely subjective hypothesis. And the idea of verifying it, all this stuff about verification of a scientific proposition, you've got to verify. The original observation is a hypothesis. To verify it is just, you can only verify it in terms of another hypothesis. What makes you think the second hypothesis is more valid than the first one? Because the verification involves another observation, which is also a hypothesis. If you actually look at the underlying assumptions of science, you'll see none of them stand up. They're all illusory.
There's no doubt that there is some disillusionment, particularly among the young, and the growing interest in religious matters, whether it's a meditation or whether it is living in simpler life in the communities and rural areas. There is a tremendous disillusionment with science and technology, and there is a hunger for some kind of spiritual fulfillment and nourishment. But what is this spiritual or perennial wisdom that you seem to indicate that is necessary?
Well, I agree with you 100%. what you just said, I think, is tremendously important. I think that more and more people are feeling that way. They see the world we've created as being, above all, squalid. It's squalid. You see, the economic policy of this country is utterly squalid. We manufacture torture instruments in Birmingham, ship them throughout the world. You see, torture instruments, we're one of the greatest producers. I mean, it's squalid to produce that. An economy that justifies, a society that accepts that we should earn our money by selling torture instruments, by selling pesticides that give everybody cancer, by selling armaments of all sorts, you see, is a squalid society. We've created a totally, utterly squalid society. And people are beginning to realize that. They're reacting against it. I'm sure. And people, as you say, are hungry for these spiritual values. Well, a lot of different spiritual values. There's not one. People are searching in all directions. A lot of them looking towards the East, of course, which has a sort of greater spirituality than we do here in the West. But it's a search. In some cases, a frantic search.
You also went to the East, you went to India, and you were tremendously influenced by Gandhi.
You arranged for me in 1974 to go and work for the Gandhi Peace Foundation in Delhi, where I spent some months.
That's right.
And where I learned a great deal. A great, great deal. Indeed, you mentioned a few minutes ago the perennial philosophy, which you suggested. That's another interesting movement. The Gandhian movement is of course tremendously important, because I see Mahatma Gandhi as having understood just about all the problems we face today. He understood them. His understanding of these problems is truly amazing, because this goes back to the 30s and the 40s. The notion of our health as nature cure, our economics, the economics of Chaka, whatever the problem, whatever problem you look at, he understood. He understood it. So, I mean, this is a tremendous experience for me, to work there with these people in Delhi. The perennial philosophy is also something I'm interested in. It's basically a group of people, perhaps the most famous was Ananda Kumaraswamy, but there are others, Europeans like René Guénon and Lord Northbourne in this country, all sorts of people. And they're really interested in the wisdom which underlies all your traditional societies. And there is such a wisdom. They call it the perennial philosophy. And of course, it's based largely on tradition. They are talking about traditional knowledge. And I don't believe that you can replace traditional knowledge. You see, societies have maintained their continuity by transmitting the traditional wisdom from one generation to the next. That's what education is about. It means that children learn how to fulfill their functions within their community. You see, and learn, and to do that they have to understand their traditional culture, because that traditional culture provides them with a blueprint for living within that community. We've lost sight of what education is about. Well, it's clear that what you're transmitting, this traditional wisdom, is critical. And if you look at the traditional wisdoms that are transmitted, they have an enormous amount in common. And this brings me back to what I was saying earlier on. The main thing they have in common is that they see the world of living things, the biosphere, the cosmos, if you want to look beyond, as a source of all benefits. And that the pattern of behavior they develop is that which they regard as capable of maintaining this critical order of the cosmos. If you break a taboo, for instance, why is it so important, so terrible to break a taboo? It's because by breaking a taboo, you threaten the critical order of the cosmos. And if you do that, all hell is let loose. In fact, every problem is interpreted by traditional man as due to his diversion from the path or way, the Tao, if you like, or the Dharma, or the Rita among the Vedic Indians, the path that you must follow in order to maintain the critical order of the cosmos. If you divert from it, then this order is shattered, and you get all these terrible, terrifying problems. You only get earthquakes, you get epidemics, you get enemy invasions, you get floods, you get droughts. We laugh at that, but it's true. Why do you think we have droughts today in Asia, in India, for instance? Why are there large droughts? Why are there floods? Because we've cut down all the forests. If you cut down all the forests, you get floods. You have to. Floods can only be attributed to the destruction of forests. Because the forests are now, in the roots of the forest, you have the roots of the forest are like huge sponges. When the rains come, the water is absorbed in these sponges and released slowly to the rivers. If you cut the forest down, instead of having these sponges under the forest, you have concrete. It's hard. There's no forest left. It's hard. When it rains, the water pours off into the rivers, takes the soil with it. So the beds of the rivers are raised, water pours into it, and you get a massive flood. It's happening everywhere. Our traditional man understood this. He said, if you have a drought or if you have a flood, it's because you've upset the order of the cosmos. It's precisely what we've done. We've cut down the forests. And so it is with every problem you look at. In fact, their interpretation of the problems is correct. Our interpretation is the opposite of the truth, the scientific interpretation. We say that the problems are due to insufficient diversion from the way, from the correct. We haven't diverted sufficiently. You see, if we have a problem, overpopulation, because we haven't distributed enough contraceptives, or because these people are poor, therefore they have insecurity, therefore we have to develop them, and then they'll have security and they won't have so many children. If they're sick, it's because we haven't got enough hospitals. Every problem is interpreted in such a way as to justify further economic development and hence a further diversion from the correct path you must take to maintain the order of the cosmos, a further destruction of this critical order by covering more and more land with cement, by cutting down more trees, by eroding more soil. So we interpret our problems with all our science and technology in the totally wrong way. It's the opposite of the truth, our interpretation of the problems we face, because we see these problems in terms of the totally wrong worldview.
Is there a balance between the traditional social way of life and individuals' desire for freedom?
Well, of course, there's an element of truth in that if you live in a very cohesive community, you are subject to social control which applied by public opinion, which reflects the traditional customs and laws. And some people today in particular find this intolerable, because the tyranny of public opinion could be considered worse than the tyranny exercised by a dictator. That's how people feel. But this social control is the only control that ever works. The police don't maintain order. I've seen graphs that show that the more police you have, you see the higher the crime rate. I mean, you'd think that the police are actually committing the crimes. But it's nothing to do with that, of course. It so happens that your crime is increasing in any case, and that the police can really have very little effect on it. The only control we have is the control of public opinion. It's the only one that's ever worked. Social control is the only one that's ever worked. Now, this notion of freedom. You see, we see freedom as the freedom to do what we like. Free trade sounds good, it's free. But free trade is the freedom of corporations to exploit, pollute, and destroy, without any controls applied to them, without labor controls, without pollution controls, without any control. That's what free trade's about. You see, we think, what is freedom? The Greeks, of course, freedom was the ability to govern yourself. The Greeks were free because they governed themselves. The Persians were slaves, the Persians, because they were governed by an autocrat. But to govern yourself requires discipline. And the Greeks displayed this discipline, considerable discipline. And it wasn't the question of doing your own thing, doing anything you like, total anarchy. That's not out of the question. That's not freedom. And if you're thinking in terms of individualism, you'll find there are individuals in a traditional society. I never noticed that there are people lacking in individuality. What we've created is a world of anonymous, alienated people who are subjected to no social constraints of any kind. And I don't think these people are happy at all. I think these people are miserable. The problem with our youth today is not that they're being subjected to social constraints, as Freud would have said. It's the opposite. It's they're subjected to no constraints. They don't know where they are. As we mentioned earlier, they have no identity. They don't know where to go. They're like leaves blowing in the wind.
But Teddy, your whole philosophy seems to be very pessimistic. Is there any hope for this world?
Well, if we go on in the present direction, the answer is no. The human species is extinct in a matter of decades. And I don't believe that anybody can seriously deny that. It's perfectly evident that we are making this planet uninhabitable. But that doesn't mean we have to continue in this direction. I can see a possibility of a real awakening. I think there's been an explosion in environmental consciousness in the last 2 years. An explosion that has not been translated into any action on the part of our politicians or industrialists who've done practically nothing. Our governments have made small cosmetic changes, but they've really done nothing to counteract the major problems that we face. But I think there's a chance that this will change. It's by no means certain, but I think it's at least possible.